we got Isabelle Chiming coming back to Chipspace after what, 2 years? And she is here to give us some advanced Famitracker techniques. And Isabelle is going to show you some tricks to make songs sound more like songs. Let's go.
Hi, is this on? Yeah, it sounds like it is. Hello, everyone. I'm Isabelle Chiming, and this is my informational demonstration presentation workshop, Beyond 1-1, how to make better chiptune. I'm going to take this out of the... Can I take this out of the stand? It'll be easier for me to maneuver. Is that bad? Yeah. You can do it. Woo! Okay. Bear with me with this. Due to technical difficulties, it's kind of got to be looking like this instead of like full screen, and I thought it would be on my screen and I could see it from here. So bear with me. And also my epic Google slide transitions aren't going to be here, but that's okay. So yeah, I wanted to talk about the purpose of this, like Amy said, is there's sort of two audiences I sort of see that can benefit the most from this. The first is people who've just gotten into chiptune. Maybe you've watched like a tutorial on how Famitracker works, by default, but you might be wondering, like, how do I make my music sound more advanced, like the expert chiptuners make? And so this is going to talk about the techniques that people use. Just to take it from really basic chiptune to like something that sounds good and complex, and like it doesn't just use a tiny handful of channels. So yeah, and also, if you don't know anything about chiptune and you're wondering how chiptuners do that, this will give you some insight on how that works. So yeah, a couple caveats. I'm only talking about sort of like the hardware accurate, what's possible directly on the NES, and I'm not talking about anything like post-production or anything. I think it's very cool, but I'm not talking about that. And this will mostly focus on like NES/Famicom chiptune. Technically, there's differences between the NES and the Famicom, but I use them sort of interchangeably in this presentation. But these tips can definitely apply to other types of chiptune as well. And by the way, just to tell you that I know what I'm talking about a little bit, I've been doing chiptune for 10 years. I started making crappy garbage in middle school. And I, I've made a number of like long-form chiptune albums. I won a contest to write a game soundtrack in 48 hours. I'm an aspiring game composer. I've worked on a couple projects, and I have a few more down the line. And I kind of have a slightly decent semi-internet following. 3.6K subscribers. Hello. It's the most in my IRL friend group, but I'm probably going to get beaten out by my friend who does Bionicle video essays soon. So that's fine. But yeah, so that's who I am. All right. So first question that simply must be answered. What is chiptune? Dictionary.com defines chiptune as music with like bits, and there's like 8 bits. There's like 8 bit. Wait, what else is? Do you guys like Undertale? Have you heard of? Yeah, it's like Undertale. Okay, just kidding. I assume that you guys already know generally what chiptune is if you're here at the Chipspace at MAGFest watching this presentation. If you don't know, I guess Google it. So I didn't want to bore you with the details of what chiptune is. But what I did want to talk about is the few things in chiptune that are going to be really important to know for this presentation. Biggest thing to keep in mind is that in chiptune, there are sound channels. And there's 3 sort of traits to sound channels depending on the chip that you're using. The first is that there is a limited number of sound channels. So you only have a certain number of possible sounds depending on the chip. Each sound channel can only make 1 sound at a time. One sound channel can make 2 simultaneous sounds. And 3, each sound channel has a specific type of sound it can make. They're called waveforms, and the waveforms affect timbre. timbre is basically in music like what the sound is. So like the difference between a piano and a guitar, even if they're playing the same note, they sound different. That's the difference. That's a difference in timbre. And that's what each sound channel will generally be able to do. They might be able to do one timbre or a small selection of them. So that's sort of the idea with sound channels. The primary sound channel for the NES/Famicom is the Rico 2A03. Rico's the company that made it. It's not that important. And basically, it is made up of 5 sound channels. You've probably heard this before. 2 pulse wave channels. Each of those channels can make up to 3 possible timbre of sound. Again, that's the type of the sound. A triangle channel, which can only make triangle waves. It also doesn't have fine volume control. It's either on or off. The noise generator channel, which creates noise like TV static. It's the same kind of thing. It can do this in 16 different pitches of noise, so it sounds lower up to higher. And DBCM, basically, it plays low quality samples, and that are often very short. So yeah, that's the overview of the NES's sound chip. Additionally, you might have heard of expansion chips. These were chips that were included in Famicom games, only Famicom, not the NES, that could, I mean, many cartridges had expansion chips in them, but only certain ones had audio expansions. And honestly, very few of them did. A few that you might have heard of are the Famicom Disk System. If you've ever heard the Japanese versions of Metroid or Zelda, they have extra sound that you wouldn't normally hear on the NES. A very common one in modern chiptune is the Konami VRC6. Adds 3 extra sound channels, most popularly used in Castlevania 3, but there's a couple other games that were also cool, so, you know. And Sunsoft 5B, let's go! Most famously and maybe only used in Gimmick. I don't know if anyone can fact check me on that. But yeah, so that's our basic overview of the things that you're gonna know. I'm not gonna go into the details of what these sound chips do because I'm not focused on the specific technicalities of all of them. I'm just gonna talk about how to use them. So yeah. So let's get on with the first main slide that actually has new information on it. So I've sort of divided this presentation into 3 categories, maybe 3 tenets of chiptune. It's not like a established thing. I kind of just picked them for what I thought was important. But the first tenet I want to talk about is channel economy. Channel economy is the concept of how efficiently you are using your channels. How much detail can you squeeze out of one sound channel that can only make one sound at a time, right? Sort of the goal of channel economy is to make it sound like there are more sound channels, more simultaneous sounds than there actually are. So that's sort of the goal of channel economy. And I have 3 sort of methods of how to achieve that. The first is part switching. So it's simple to understand, but very difficult to master. It's basically swapping between 2 different musical ideas in one channel, sort of on the fly, creating the illusion that these two ideas are layering on top of one another. You can't always do this. I wouldn't recommend it in a very prominent melody. I'd reserve it for counter melodies or harmonies or certain types of bass lines because otherwise the illusion is broken. You're gonna see with chiptune, a lot of it is about making illusions, making a sort of psychological trick to make it seem more complicated than it technically is, even though it ends up being very complicated in the end. So yeah, and I would say for part switching, it helps if the 2 musical ideas you're swapping between are very different. Because if they're too similar, they're just gonna congeal in the listener's mind into one single sound, one single part, and it's not gonna be as convincing or interesting. So I have some examples. Pardon, I apologize that this is not as visible as I wanted it to be, but that's okay. So in this example, all the examples here are just various songs that I've made over the years. In this example, the melody has a variety of harmonies. It's a 3-part harmony in the melody, but then halfway through this example, one of the harmonies is going to swap out for another sort of twinkly idea on top, and then quickly swap back, and it's very difficult to notice the difference. The twinkly idea is very different rhythmically and like sound-wise, like tonally from that harmony, and that makes the illusion stronger. So I don't know how visible it's going to be because of the setup, but I'm going to try. Oh, yeah, see, now we're on. Where are we? There we go. All right, so just see if you can pick that out, and I'll maybe try to make it visible. Here we go. So, as you can see, well, it might be hard to see, but you might be able to pick out that little twinkly sound that came on top swapped out with the harmony. Let me see if I can isolate just that channel so you can hear the swap happen. Come on, there we go. If the channels are ever in red, that means they're turned off, so you're not hearing them. So here's just sort of that one channel isolated. So you can see it changed from one idea to another on the fly, and you sort of don't catch it. So that's part switching. Next, I want to talk about ARPs. ARPs is shorthand for arpeggios. It's a music theory term. In say a 3-note chord, you might have C major, C, E, G. An arpeggio would be if you played all 3 of those notes separately instead of simultaneously. So it might go C, E, G, like that. I don't think those were C, E, G, but you know, you get the point. In chiptune, because a computer is playing this sound, you can do that arpeggio really, really fast, and that creates the illusion like the entire chord happened using just one channel. So it's basically doing an arpeggio so fast that it sounds like one cohesive unit, one chord in a single channel. Yeah, and there's lots of stuff that you can take into account with arpeggios. There's lots of different variety. A big thing to take into account is the speed of the arpeggio. How fast is it actually going? If it's too slow, you lose the illusion. But if it's too fast, it can sound abrasive and robotic. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Oh gosh. Control O. No? Oh, there it is. Bear with me. Where's my mouse? Oh, I see. Hello? Has anyone seen my mouse? There it is. Come on. Chill.
Hit escape. I think that you opened something by
Oh, there we go. Yes. So this is a short example from Rhythm Heaven Fever, and you'll be able to hear 2 different channels doing these ARPs, sort of warbling between a couple notes really fast. So yeah, to isolate those channels, the pulse 2 sounds like this. Technically, it's only playing 2 notes, so it's not technically musically an arpeggio, but chiptune-wise, it is an arpeggio. And then the pulse 1 switches from the melody to a different arpeggio. So yeah, what was I gonna say? The ARPs are being used as sort of rhythmic hits, like maybe like a piano might play or something. But you could also, I tend to use them as like background to sound like a choir or like a synth pad. I think that's a really good use of ARPs as well. But yeah, so that's what I had to say on ARPs. And now, the last thing I want to talk about is pulse and triangle percussion. This is like, I think this is especially common in like LSD jig music. I hear it like all the time. And there's no triangle channel on there, but basically anytime you use a tonal channel to emphasize percussion that's usually being done by the noise channel, and on NES also the DPCM, it can help a lot to use your tonal channels to boost that sound, either making it sound like a kick drum or making it sound like an entire snare drum. And this allows for you to part switch super fast. Percussive sounds are really short, and so you can sneak in percussive hits and then still continue the melody really soon after, and you lose almost no detail. So let's get in my example of that. Show up in the same place. Yay. So this is an example from a crappy game. But you'll be able to hear there's a really impactful percussive sound that I used for a specific effect in this track. So those percussive hits are really strong. Now here the percussion is being done by the DPCM, triangle, and pulse 2. The DPCM sounds just like this, which is pretty impactful on its own, but the heart of it is definitely in the tonal stuff. Like here's the triangle, and especially the pulse 2, like this. If, say, I had the entire thing, if I had it without that pulse 2, it sounds much less impactful. Oh, it did on my headphones. It might sound good on these speakers, but we'll see. See, like that pulse 2 is really the heart of that sound. And additionally, if you listen closely to it, the triangle and the pulse are also landing on the bass line. So you're getting that super impactful hit and then also getting the bass line at the same time, so showing off that part switching. So yeah, this can be a really, really powerful tool to strengthen the impact of your percussion, which can be really hard to do. Percussion in general is hard to do in chiptune, which is why we're going to move on from channel economy and talk about sound design. And the first part of sound design I'm going to talk about is percussion, because it can be hard to figure out how to make it work really well. So yeah, these examples are going to fit better on NES because it involves the DPCM channel, but it's sort of the same idea. Let's see here. There it is. So, a drum set is divided into three, like at the very basics of drum set is there are three ideas. There's the kick drum, the boom, boom, the like bass drum that you're hearing, the snare, the ka, ka, that's like giving you the drive, and the hi-hat, that's like adding to the like tempo of it. I don't really know why drums work the way they do, but they're awesome. So the way you would do each of these elements on NES would be, in my opinion, this is what I would do. I would use the DPCM for the kick drum. If you're looking for DPCM samples online, there are big collections of all the DPCM samples used in NES Famicom games that you can find online. Those are great because they were designed for this hardware in mind. You can also import your own samples, but using DPCM from actual games is a good way to get yourself a good head start. But yeah, so I'll play the full example in the end of it. But the DPCM here is doing the kick drum by itself. The noise channel isn't helping at all, and it's also doing half of the snare sound. And we're going to see in a second, the noise channel is doing the other half of that snare sound. So let's just do the DPCM by itself. So you can hear the kick drum sound is very strong on its own. You can definitely hear it in the mix regardless. The snare sound is a little bit weak on its own. So we also, for the snare, have the help of the noise channel. Now let's look. I feel like a contortionist doing this. Oh my God. So this curve is basically the way the volume of my snare instrument moves, if that makes sense. It's like every time the snare instrument plays, it does this curve of volume. Because I wanted to clarify, I realized I wanted to say earlier, the reason sound design is important in chiptune is because you have to make every sound. I mean, some people use pre-made instruments, but a lot of the time, people start from scratch. They have a few waveforms, and they make all the sounds that you hear, all the instruments, and that's a really important part of making your chiptune as good as possible and developing your own style. So that's why it's such an important thing to talk about. But yeah, I sort of describe this shape as I think someone on a Discord server or something called it the perfect curve. I sort of picture it as like a roller coaster. It goes really fast down a drop and then sort of slows down and goes to the loading area to pick people up. That's sort of the curve I generally go for. This isn't the most sheer drop, but generally going for that sort of curve like that, picturing that roller coaster, I think gives you solid snare sounds right off the bat. And I'm not the greatest at percussion. There's people who are insane at percussion, but this is a pretty good example. And then, let's see. Oh, and also snare sounds generally, the core of the sound is a mid-range pitch in the noise channel. So, because I mentioned that the noise channel has 16 pitches. So you want to go for something sort of in the middle. But the hi-hat, either hi-hat that I'm going to get into in a second, you want to be a high pitch range, definitely closer to the top. If you get too high, you can't really hear it at all. Let's see here. Get over here. Come on. So in drum set, there's two different ways you can play the hi-hat. There's the closed hi-hat, which is like a short tick, and there's the open hi-hat, which hisses, rings out. So this is my closed hi-hat. It's sort of like a mini version of the perfect curve. There's a lot fewer volume inputs here, so it ends much sooner. And if you put that at a high frequency, then it'll sound like a hi-hat. And then for an open hi-hat, this isn't the greatest open hi-hat, but I think it gets the job done. It looks pretty different. It has a more traditional, or not a more traditional, a more smooth curve downward, and it never actually peters out, because that gives you as much ring out time as you want, and you can always just kill the sound when you want to. But yeah, so yeah, come on. In this example, the noise and the DPCM working together sound like this. And in the full mix, it sounds like this. Me too. He's great. I like Undertale and Mega Man more, though. All right, so that was kind of a lot, but that's everything I wanted to say on percussion. It's a complicated subject. There's so much more you could go into with percussion. Biggest thing, and the biggest rule with learning all chiptune, is download other people's modules and just look at them and steal their stuff, because it's awesome, and that's how I learned all this stuff. Woo, stealing. The next thing I wanted to talk about is pulse width modulation. Basically, I'm not going to get into the super specifics of what it is, but basically, it is when you swap between two different timbres of pulse wave on the fly. Well, not two different pulse timbres, many different pulse wave timbres. However much pulse wave timbres you want, you can put in there, and it adds the potential for an even higher level of complexity of sound, if that's what you want. Yeah, it's more complexity, but it's also more risk if you're not careful with how you use your pulse width modulation. It can sound abrasive and weird and not very good. One way to do it that a lot of people do is they will move sort of smoothly between many very similar timbres and sort of loop that, and it creates a very complex synth sound, which is what I do in the next example. Wow. Okay. I lost it again. Did anybody see it?
Hiding from you.
I know. Come on. Ah. Okay. Found it. Sorry about that. So in this example, the lead instrument looks like this. This represents all the different pulse widths. And you can see the pulse widths, they make this nice staircase, and that means that the difference between them is going to be very smooth, and they're going to be very similar to one another. And that makes the lead sound like this. Yeah, that's from my personal concept album about gender called I Aurora. Look it up on my Bandcamp. But yeah, you can hear that it almost sounds like a modern synth or something like that. Like it sounds very full and interesting. Another way to do it that I'll show really quick is you can make, if you want the sound, what am I trying to say? At the beginning of the sound, which is called the attack, you can switch between two very different pulse widths, and that creates a stronger attack sound that a lot of game composers used this back in the day. It was a common way to make things more complicated. There we go. I figured out how to tame this mouse now. So in this example, my lead instruments pulse widths look like this. There's a little bit more of a difference here. And also, it's not going to loop. It's only going to happen at the beginning of the sound. And that makes the lead instrument go from something that sounds... This is what it would sound like if I didn't have all that stuff. That'll work. To this. You can see it has just a different start to it. This is from Zelda CDI, by the way. Good game. Here's the full song of that, if you want to hear it. Yo, the mixing on that sucks. What the frick? That was terrible. Okay. So yeah, that is pulse width modulation. That's the kind of thing where just experiment with it, and if it sounds good, do it. And if it doesn't sound good, don't do it. And that's pretty much how I would go about that. Okay, the last thing on sound design is simulated reverb/delay. This is basically the process of making it sound like the sound is echoing through some sort of space, maybe like a recording space. I actually originally had an entire slide on this because there's so much you can talk about with it, and I think it's such an important tenet of how to do chiptune really well. Having this kind of echo, it just psychologically it makes stuff sound better. My friend R3 once said that if your lead instrument sucks, just try boosting it up in the mix and adding echo, and it sounds way better. And it's true, every time. It literally sounds better every time. So let's talk about ways to do that. I'm a genius. Okay. So there's sort of two avenues you can go about with this. The first is two-channel echo. Basically, it's pretty simple. Take all of the contents of the channel that you want to have echo and copy it into another channel, but move it down a little bit later and make it a lot quieter. And basically, it sounds like it's echoing through the room. I'm going to play the example without the echo, and then I'm going to play it with the echo. Just see if you can spot the difference. It's a little subtle, but I think you can tell. And here it is with the echo. I don't know how obvious that is, but it really does make a difference. Maybe if there were fewer channels, it would be even more noticeable. But yeah, you do have to be careful with it. If you use it too much, it can make the mix really muddy. I would generally reserve it for a main melody, maybe a counter melody. If it's really interesting and good and prominent, then I would do it. But yeah, otherwise, I would be wary of it. And also, it's inefficient. It takes up two channels. Is there a way we can do echo in one channel? Yes. Good thing. There is such a thing as one-channel echo. But the thing about one-channel echo is it's also situational. Basically, one-channel echo is the idea that you have like the notes of whatever melody you have, in the rests in between the notes, insert very quietly and very briefly a note that you heard earlier, and in the space in between, you get a type of echo effect there too. So in this example, let's see here. In the VRC6 Pulse 2, there's an echo in between all the different notes, and that creates the sound that makes it sound more reverberant like this. Yeah, the little symbol here, there's like a sort of like up arrow and then a 2. That's called an echo buffer. It's basically it basically calls back to a note however many notes ago that you're reading. If you don't know how to use it in Famitracker, go to configuration and it'll like show a little box for where you can put the echo buffer button, and you can put it in because it's not bound automatically. So use it, and you control the number on it by controlling its octave. So just keep that in mind. Look out for the echo buffer. It's very good. But yeah, I'm also doing it in the VRC6 Pulse 1 with the entire main melody without the echo buffer, because it was a little easier to keep track of if I just did it manually, and it sounds like this. If you listen really carefully, you can hear that I'm calling back to previous notes in between there, and it makes the whole thing sound like this. Yeah, so that's the two main ways you can do echo with chiptune, and that's everything that I had to say on sound design. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about with these chiptune tenets is imperfection. This music is electronic. It is always going to play everything perfectly in time, in rhythm, and everything's going to be totally in line unless you make it not that way. And the reason, it might sound counterintuitive, but what I learned, especially when I actually have a master's in music composition. You don't need a degree to do this stuff, but I wanted one for some reason. Thank you. But what I really learned there was how important it is to add a sort of human element to music. I had these like professors who were so used to hearing live instruments that when they heard my music, they wanted a lot more detail, they wanted there to be more variety, and they wanted me to add a lot more to the process. And it also made me think about the tropes and techniques that chiptune was already using that are accomplishing that. So yeah, because there's something psychological. We want to hear the music. We want the music to feel like it's being played by real people, just because we're people. I don't really know how to describe it, but trust me, it almost always sounds better. So how do you do that? Well, I think the biggest one that chiptuners tend to use is making their melodies as soloistic, as soulful as possible. And there's a variety of ways you can do that. I think melodies are some of the best places to do this stuff, because in real music, the band will generally be pretty locked in, but a soloist on top can kind of do whatever they want. If you listen to any popular song that you've heard, they go all over that beat, and once you hear it, you can't really unhear it. Where am I? Yes. So let me show one way to do that with, there it is, with pitch slides. Pitch slides are another thing that's like chiptune bread and butter. Chiptuners love to use pitch slides, and for good reason. You don't want to overuse them, but it's kind of hard to overuse them. They sound really good because they just add more complexity. You're hearing all those little notes in between the two notes that you're starting and ending at. So here's an example. The melody at first here, here, I'll play it on its own. The melody at first here doesn't have pitch slides because I wanted to reference the original track, but then, halfway through, I add pitch slides, and it adds a lot more life and intrigue to it. So let's hear that. And there's a couple couple other details in there, like vibrato. Definitely use vibrato. Figure out which effect. In Famitracker, it's 4. So yeah, definitely use vibrato and a couple other ornaments and stuff. But yeah, it makes the melody a little bit less repetitive, and it just feels cooler and better. I don't know how to really put it other than that. Here it is in the whole mix. So yeah. All right. The next way I would make your melodies more soloistic. I don't see people do this as much, but I really like it. One of the things that humans don't do is play perfectly on the grid of the rhythm. They tend to, like I was saying, they tend to fly off that rhythm a lot. So sometimes, especially if you want something to be really soloistic, try like doing a note that's just a little bit later than when it would normally happen. Or do something that just is kind of in its own meter altogether. So I'm going to start with just the drums and the solo in this track from my concept album, just so you can hear how the beat feels and then how the solo is sort of moving off the beat. I'll make a little signal when there's a note that happens a little bit later. Or if I remember all of them, we'll see. And then in a sec, it's gonna be like not even close to on the rhythm, you'll see. So yeah, like right at the end there, you can hear that whole like line, like it's just sort of in its own meter entirely. And I think that just adds a lot more detail to this solo. I think that it partially came about here because I tend to write solos by playing them on the piano first, and then I transfer them over into what I'm making. Which, if you are proficient in like soloing for an instrument, can be a really good tool. But you don't need to be able to do that to do this kind of stuff. But yeah, here's what it sounds like in the full mix. So next, I'm going to talk about something very important. Avoid phasing. Phasing is something that happens when I don't know how to describe this. I had it in my head. When two waveforms are playing at the same pitch and are too similar to one another, they will, when they combine to make the timbre of them together, they will cancel each other out. The waveforms will sort of mess with each other and change the sound and generally make it sound more artificial, and you don't want it to sound artificial. Yeah, this can happen if you have, between two channels, if you have like, especially if it's a unison, which means the notes are the same, but also if it's in octaves or even fifths can create phasing. And so how do you combat this? The answer is fine pitch effects. In Famitracker, it's the P effect. You just take whatever instrument that you want to not phase with something else and raise it up or down a teeny little bit in pitch, and it can make a huge difference. I'm actually going to pull up an old example because I realize it's a better example of this. Where is it? There it is. So it's really important, especially when we're talking about two-channel echo, which I talked about earlier. Originally, I wanted to have it so that I would show it with the phasing, but I don't think I can do that because I don't know where the P is on this enigma of a screen. So just listen carefully to, this is the melody and the echo, and you can hear that they're rubbing up against each other just a little bit and avoiding a very artificial sound. Yeah, you'll have to take my word for it. If I disabled all that stuff, it would sound really weird. I'm sorry that I can't demonstrate it here, but I just know my limits. I will not be able to figure that out. Yeah, but another thing that fine pitch can let you do is make really sick, crunchy bass if you're willing to sacrifice more channels than you normally would. Let me show you. In this example, the VRC6 1 and 2 are basically playing in unison, but are somewhat fairly spread out from one another in fine pitch, and so they really rub against each other, and you get a bass sound like this. So, yeah, this song's from Action 52, by the way. But yeah, and there's also pulse width modulation going on there, and over there there's a single channel echo, and then somewhere else there's like 2-channel echo. It all builds upon itself, and so in the full mix, that bass sounds like this. So yeah, it's another thing you can do with fine pitch effects that can be really good. And the very last thing that I want to talk about is variation. This especially I learned when I went to school. Generally, it's fine to copy and paste for convenience's sake, but I would strongly recommend that, especially with a melody, if you copy and paste it verbatim, just make a couple little changes every single time it changes. Every single time that you repeat it, add a different spot for a pitch slide, change the volume a little bit, change the rhythm, change the notes that you're using. Do these teeny little details, because humans, again, they don't play the same thing the same way twice. And it's a huge benefit, and it will just make your music much more interesting to listen to. And I think it depends on the genre. I think ravey kind of more specifically electronic music can get away with doing it the same way over and over. But even then, I don't know. I think it might sound even cooler if it had more variation in it. And so for my last example, this is a song from the Japanese version of Zelda 2. Let me pull it up here. Yeah, right there. So pay attention to this melody. It's really, here, I'll play it by itself. It's a very repetitive melody, but I made the choice to not repeat it the same way twice, basically. And there's always a slight variation on it that you can hear every time. Yeah, and so it just makes it sound much more interesting, especially when you put it with the full mix, like this. So yeah, that is the benefit of not just copying and pasting everything verbatim. I really recommend it. And well, that is just about it. Yeah, there's so much more I could talk about with chiptune. There's so many more things that I was gonna talk about, and then I couldn't fit it into this time slot. But yeah, like I said before, if you really want to learn, the best way to learn is find people's stuff, look at what they're doing, and take it. It's great. It's the way I learned this stuff. It's the way most people learn this stuff. I'm happy to be a resource for learning this stuff more directly, but seeing how people do it is always the best way to do it. But yeah, thank you guys. Do we have time for questions?
I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
Wow.
So please come up if you have questions. I mean, we've just been given a master's level course in Famitracker here.
I guess. Thank you guys. Thank you so much.
You young lady, do you have a question?
Yeah, how did you first discover the crunchy bass pitch thing? Because I do SNES stuff, and I heard that kind of being used in Chrono Trigger's Final Boss theme, and I tried that in a few things a couple of years back.
That's really cool that they use that in Chrono Trigger. That's super cool. I think I found out about it from a guy who I stole the most from, RushJet1. In his
RushJet1 was here last night, in case you didn't catch it.
Wow. But yeah, he in his Mega Man 2 album, I think for one of his boss rush tracks, there's this part at the beginning, and it had this crazy bass sound, and I was like, how did he do that? And I found his modules he used for that on the forums. I looked at them, and I saw how he did it, and I was like, wow, that's sick. So that's how I learned it.
We have
Yeah,
another
thank you.
question.
All right. So if we like your music and we wanted to hear more of it, where could we find you?
Thanks for asking. Wow.
Wow, that wasn't prompted at all. Paid plant. No, I'm kidding.
I'm Isabelle Chiming on YouTube. I'm Isabelle Chiming on Bandcamp. I'm not Isabelle Chiming on SoundCloud. Don't listen to my SoundCloud. It's just memes. But yeah, YouTube and Bandcamp are the main places. I'm Isabelle Chiming there. I'm also on Twitter. I don't really use my Twitter. But yeah, YouTube, Bandcamp. That's the place.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have one last question.
Ever since you got like better at doing that stuff, did you start making your own instruments?
Yeah, the whole sound design slide was sort of me talking about that. Yeah, definitely, I would strongly recommend making your own instruments. Pre-mades are good, especially if you're doing something in a specific style. It's super good to use pre-made instruments, but make your own instruments, because that means you can adjust all the little fine details and make sure your mix sounds really good, and you can develop your own style as well. I think that's another really valuable part of it. So I would recommend, and if you don't know how to make your own instruments, look at how other people have made instruments, and then instead of just copying, try to do something similar. One of my composition professors from one of my schools, who passed away a couple years ago, but he was amazing. But he told me that, like, with music, if you just steal and copy, because you're probably not good enough to actually do it correctly anyway, and so it'll be different. It'll be unique because you're not good enough to actually copy it. So that's genuinely my real advice. Copy it, like, not with copy and paste. Copy it with your own hand, if that makes sense.
So there is precedent with that in visual art in that many painters are taught by forging paintings. So there is nothing wrong with copying. That is how you learn your basics. That is how you learn your fundamentals. So yeah, this totally makes sense. This jives.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right.
Okay, thank you, everyone.